This is Kelly Michelko, and I'm speaking with Mr. Ernest Gould at the Don Ross Center in North Battleford. And today is August 12th, 1985. And Mr. Gould, maybe you could tell me a bit about your family before they came to Canada.
My mother and dad were raised in London, England at Walthamstow. I do not know why they came out to Canada, really. They settled in Cecilin, Ontario, which is between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie, where I was born. They came out in 1910. I was born in 1911. A year later, or almost a year later, they moved to North Battleford in 1912, because of the boom days in North Battleford. My father was an English plumber and steam fitter, which had spent many, many years in technical school and 7 years in apprenticeship. And there was the opportunity out in Western Canada to be his own boss. He did do the plumbing along with Ernie Lane and Bert Lewis, two other Englishmen, in installing the plumbing and steam fitting in the North Battleford Collegiate Institute, the Auditorium Hotel, and many, many other buildings throughout North Battleford. They worked together for many years, rather independently. At that time, North Battleford was a very small city, less than 5,000 people, or just about 5,000 people. And I've lived here practically ever since.
Any brothers and sisters that came from London with your parents? Or?
Yes, I had 4 brothers that came from England, and then they came out west with the family. We were all small kids. My first recollection is living along just across from King Street School, and then we had a drayman come up and pick up our furnishings and take them away out to the end of Charles Street, where at that time I did not realize what was going on, but the First World War had broken out, and my dad was enlisting, and he was moving us to a home where we'd be taken care of with my mother, and a house of his own.
I suppose in those days, that area of town was sparsely populated, few houses.
You wouldn't believe it. We lived at 1656 Charles Street, which today is 107th Street. And for about 3 blocks south of where we lived was vegetable gardens, and they reached over to James Street, Charles Street, and Arthur Street. And this was run by the father-in-law of Joshua H. Greaves, who was an active real estate man in the city of North Battleford at that time, and also the surrounding district. The north part, like where the comprehensive high school is today, was a big slough, a very large slough that reached from the airport over to 101st Street, or Victoria Street as it was known in those days. And that's where we learned to skate, also where we learned to swim, which we weren't allowed to do. And further north of that was another slough, which we commonly called the second slough. There was willow bushes around that. We could hide there swimming easier than we could in the first slough.
And last time I spoke to you, you said that your father and a couple other men that he worked with had a bit of competition with another plumber, I suppose, or tinsmith, Jack Titterley. Maybe you can tell us about that.
As I understand the story, Jack Titterley was a tinsmith, another very prominent man in North Battleford in later years. And one day he stuck out a shingle that said that plumbing and tinsmithing, or tinsmithing and plumbing, and this irritated the 3 Englishmen, my father included, and they immediately quit doing any plumbing work whatsoever in the city of North Battleford, which caused quite a confusion. Ernie Lane went as a bank messenger, My dad went as a caretaker of the Roman Catholic school, convent, and church, and Bert Lewis went into the florist business. And to the best of my knowledge, none of them did any plumbing outside of a favor for somebody from that day on. Each of them went into a different business, strange as it may sound, which they may have had opposition to also.
And I guess you also attended the school in North Battleford?
Yes, I spent my time, I got kicked around a little bit, going to school during the First World War. The King Street School was used as a 232nd Battalion residence, and they had closed part of the North Battleford Collegiate Institute. I started at the North Battleford Collegiate Institute when they were having grade 1 in there, then swing to Connaught School, and then back to King Street School after the First World War. I started at the Collegiate and was going through there right in the middle of the Depression, and quit. I'd been working for Otis Jones after schools, and on Saturday that was a grocery store, making deliveries and clerking in the store. And an opportunity come to work at Western Grocers, which I did with only 5 warehouse employees at that time, and I stayed there for 27 years. I left Western Grocers after I was promoted to assistant branch manager at Flin Flon, and through personal problems with the personnel up there, I resigned and came back to work for McIntosh Publishing Co in North Battleford in 1957, and I've been there ever since.
Just getting back to World War I, you said that the 232nd was staying at the King Street School at the time. Were these local men that were living there?
They were recruited from this area, basically. I had a lot to do with the 232nd Battalion as a kid. I spent most of my days with them. I know better now than what I did when I was a little kid, that these men were coming in, they were being trained here, and then they were being moved on to Belcarche or some other place, and then sent overseas, and they were being used as reinforcements for other battalions or other divisions that were already over in Europe or in the British Isles. The 232nd had quite a reputation, a well-known battalion here, and I think that a few of them are still around North Battleford. I believe that at least 1 or 2 is still here in North Battleford.
And a kind of a funny incident related to North Battleford was a type of false alarm at the end of World War I.
Yeah, there was a false alarm. As I just remember holding my mother's hand and walking down the street, and all of a sudden the whistles of the CNR train started to blow, and the fire hall bell started to ring, and so on like that. And all of a sudden the news got out that the war had ended. As it turned out, I guess there was indication of a surrender, and it was several weeks before the actual November the 11th surrender took place. Then, when that occasion took place, I came under the subway with my mother, and we celebrated here in what they call the athletic grounds, is where the Ross Center is today, and they burnt an effigy of Kaiser William at that time. And that stands out in my mind very, very strongly, and yet I was not 6 years of age by that time.
And prior to, I suppose, getting into your career with Western Grocers and News Optimist, you were also involved in World War II.
No, that was after I was involved with Western Grocers. I went to Dundurn Camp as a bugle boy in the first year that Dundurn was open, 1927 or 1928, I think 27. And I attended militia for years and years before, and even after I worked for Western Grocers, I used to spend my holidays going to Dundurn Camp. Then as war was imminent and it was coming along, Harry Sharp, who was a major in the local militia, took a group of us and started training us on particularly map reading. All other economics of war and the problems rising from war and the need for disciplined troops. And each of those, a great number of them were killed. Of that 40 that we had here, very, very few of them left today.
And when the order came in 1939, what outfit were you associated with?
I was called out under GO, which is General Order 139, which is number 1 order of 1939, which was for the mobilization and organization of the Canadian Army in the event of war. I served as a instructor, as a orderly room clerk, as a medical clerk, all at the same time, as well as going in under to military district number 12 with their 12th district instructional cadre. We trained, first of all, officers from the University of Saskatchewan for provisional second lieutenants before sending them to Kingston, Ontario, or to Gordon Head, Vancouver Island.
And I imagine you did not go overseas?
I did not go overseas. I had known that from the start, as I had been categorized a Category C, which later was a Pullman's 3. I did serve from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast in practically every camp, basically as an instructor, ended up as the warrant officer of military district number 12 in Regina. The last 6 months I spent in the Army. I took my discharge on July the 4th, 1946. I enlisted in April 1939.
I see. Any particular individuals you remember from North Battleford that enlisted that may be still around today or that you'd like to comment about?
Ernie Grinke is here, the EMO officer, which I've known way back, a long time ago. He comes from down at Landis, and he was a major in charge of GMT wing, the General Military Training Wing of the 10th Armored Corps. And I did work with Ernie for a short while on the GMT wing. Can't recall too many others in North Battleford. Charlie Batcher, whichever he was. Charlie Batcher was the First World War. I remember an awful lot that did not come back from overseas.
And what would North Battleford have been like during the war? Would you say that it was a fairly intense atmosphere? What was the
No, it was
situation?
a easygoing atmosphere. The whole of Canada was the same way. War was accepted as a matter of fact, a necessity, and they carried on same as normal. They gave an opportunity for a lot of people. The forces gave some people an opportunity to prove themselves, as well as they had an opportunity in civilian life to move up to where there was vacancies, which if the Depression had stayed on, they would never have moved forward.
And in Canada, I suppose, during the war, there was various internment camps throughout the country. Was there anything like that in North Battleford?
No, there was many internees from North Battleford, but they were mostly sent to Medicine Hat or other places in the foothills of the Rockies, kept separate from prisoners of war that eventually come over. But, no, there was no prisoner of war camps as such in North Battleford.
And so when you were finally discharged from the war, you went back or began your work with Western Grocers.
Yeah, so I went back on, strange as it may sound, I had 7 days pre-discharge leave, and I went back to Western Grocers during that pre-discharge leave, which was the end of June 1946. I was only back 2 weeks, and I went out on the road as a salesman for Western Grocers. I was elected president of their union the same year. And the next year I was moved in as a, I guess it was credit manager, and then to buying manager. And I was put on the negotiating committee on behalf of the firm. So I sat on both sides of the table, both on the union side and the company side, which is a story all in itself.
I should have mentioned this earlier, but at the end of World War II, I'm sure there's probably celebrations as well in North Battleford. Were you around at all?
No, I was in Toronto when war was, when the day the war ended. I was at Long Branch, and it was just absolute panic. In Halifax, they smashed up the town because they tried to lock up all the liquor stores, and people tried to close up the places. But in Toronto, they left the liquor stores open, and the beer parlors were left open, and there was outside of keeping the firemen busy burning up the confetti that was over the street, putting about the fires from that. There was no disruption at all in Toronto. Not like Halifax.
Quite a celebration, though.
Oh, fantastic. You'd never see anything like it. I've never seen anything like it since.
And since your discharge and since your experience with Western Grocers, you started with the News Optimist, and I'm not sure if Irwin McIntosh would have been publisher. Was it his father at the time that you started?
When I started there, Irwin was the editor, and his father was a publisher. Fine old gentleman, Sierra McIntosh. And I came to Irwin McIntosh as a advertising manager. I worked for him for a good many years. I say I was advertising manager, I was the advertising department. And then eventually we grew to where it's quite a large group today. Eventually, when Irwin had the opportunity of going in as Lieutenant Governor of the province of Saskatchewan, the Queen's representative, I took over as the general manager and stayed as general manager there for 6 years. On his return, shortly after when he came back in June last year, I retired in July. And I've been back there shortly since. In fact, today, this afternoon, and I'm afraid I'm going to be back tomorrow, but then I hope I'm finished after that.
Mm-hmm. What would be some memorable incident while you worked with the paper that you might talk about, or something that you'd care to mention now that you're retired?
Nothing really. It's always been a fascinating life to me. There's never 2 days the same in the newspaper world. You can plan your day's work, go to work in the morning, and you're not there 5 minutes, and your whole plan has been shot, and you just carry on the best you can. You do not know what to expect, even on the first phone call, first thing in the morning. But it's always been exciting and very interesting. To me, I just love reading, do an awful lot of reading, and I just love going back into the old files and reading the old stories. When I go back to look at a specific item, I stop and read it page after page after page and never do get through. I should perhaps tell you that during the First World War, the 232nd Battalion, which I mentioned earlier, had a column called the 232nd Battalion column in the paper, and it told the events of the 232nd Battalion. And it said that there was a young man that had enlisted at King Street School and had gone on his enlistment leave, so he went to spend it in a little dairy just north of the city of North Battleford. The people were such nice hosts that he got up early Sunday morning and went out to the cow shed to milk the cow. When the farmer's daughter came out and said, "Why aren't you at the front?" And he said, "There's no milk up there."
And do you plan to retire in North Battleford, or what?
Yes, I've looked over all of BC. My wife and I took a tour for over 60 days last year to the British Isles and to all over Europe and Italy, France, Austria, and I've been to the Maritimes and then back to BC, and I think North Battleford is just as good as any place for the rest of my days.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gould.
Certainly welcome.